orchestrated fresh narrative with new characters, consistent finances, and emotional arc. Orchestrated fresh narrative with new characters, consistent finances, and emotional arc. My daughter-in-law called me at 11:15 on a Thursday to tell me, very kindly, that I shouldn't speak at dinner that night unless somebody spoke to me first. I said sure. I've been keeping quiet unless spoken to for going on 60 years, so I figured I could manage one more evening. It's just that her father knows everybody, she said. She always says her father like that, the way other people say the governor. We were talking about a dinner the night before, some big to-do over at the university, and the people at this dinner were going to be the kind of people who decide things, and I was going to be the kind of person who eats his salad and keeps his hands in his lap. Wear the gray jacket, she said, not the brown one. And please, Pop, don't get into it with anybody about the truck or the war or the price of anything. Just be easy. Can you be easy? I can be easy, I said. And don't tell the story about the dog. No dog. I mean it. These are serious people. Margot, I said, I will sit there and chew like a gentleman. I'll be so quiet you'll forget I came. There was a little pause on the line because she knew that part was true. My daughter-in-law has been married to my son for 9 years, and in 9 years she has introduced me to a great many people as Russell's father, Otis. He's retired. In a voice that closes the subject the way you'd close a screen door behind a wet dog. I have let her do it every single time. Every time. Because the introduction is accurate. I am retired in the sense that I don't punch a clock. I am Russell's father. I am Otis. There's nothing in there that isn't true. There's just a lot it leaves out. It leaves out that I am 68 years old, and I am worth a little north of $300 million, and that not one living soul at that dinner knew it, including my own son, and that the only person on God's green earth who has ever known the whole of it is dead, and her name was Verna, and I miss her every hour. But I'm getting ahead of the dinner. Let me back up, because you can't understand the table until you understand the man they sat at the bad end of it. I was born in 1957 in a river town in eastern Ohio called Bickerton, in a house that shook a little every time the mill across the water dropped a ladle. My father worked the foundry floor for 31 years. Hot metal, hot summers, a cough that came home with him in 1979 and didn't leave. My mother took in other people's laundry and cleaned the big houses up on the bluff where the mill bosses lived. I want you to picture that for a second. My mother on her knees scrubbing a kitchen floor for a woman who would walk across it in her shoes and never once look down to see who'd made it shine. That's the thing I learned before I learned to read. There are people who get looked at, and there are people who hold up the floor the looking happens on. My folks held up the floor. Nobody ever knelt down to thank them for it. I made up my mind about two things. Standing in that foundry yard the day they walked my father out with his lungs full of sand and a handshake and a clock. The first thing I decided was that I would not be poor. Plenty of men decide that. The second thing is the one that matters, and almost nobody decides it, because the minute most folks get 2 nickels, they want the whole world to hear them rattle. I decided that when I got money, I would not let it show. Not 1 penny of it. Not because I was ashamed of it, because I wanted to find out something, and there was only one way to find it out. I wanted to know whether the world would treat Otis with the foundry money any different than it treated my daddy without it. I wanted to know who people really were when they were sure I was nobody worth performing for. So I didn't go to college. We didn't have it, and I didn't want it. I went and learned to weld. By 20, I could lay a bead you could set a watch by. By 26, I had a shop of my own, me and 2 other fellows, and a roll-up door, fabricating brackets and frames and tanks, whatever the plants up and down the valley needed welded. I worked 7 days. Verna kept the books on a card table in the front room. When everybody else in the county was selling and leaving, I was buying. Empty buildings nobody wanted. A second shop, a controlling piece of a little outfit that made replacement parts for combines and balers, which I bought for the price of a decent house because the old man who owned it had no children who wanted it, and I did the math nobody else bothered to do. I'm not going to bore you with the slow part, because the slow part is the whole secret, and it's the part nobody believes. There's no trick. You buy a thing that other people are too proud or too scared to want. You fix it, you hold it, and you wait. You do that for 40 years, and you wake up one morning and a man at a bank you've never met is calling you, sir, in a tone that makes your skin crawl. By 1995, I had the shops, the parts company, 100 and some acres of bottomland that turned out to be sitting on top of a road they wanted to build. By 2010, I had folded all of it into trusts and a holding company so quiet it doesn't have a sign, doesn't have a lobby, doesn't have my name on a single public paper anybody could pull. A lawyer's office in Columbus signs everything. My name's not on it. In this country, if you set it up right, you can own half a county and never appear in the paper once. I set it up right. Today, I am worth a little better than $300 million. And here is how I live. I live in the same 4-bedroom on Cleet Street that Verna and I bought in 1988 for $61,000. Paid off in full, no mortgage, the kitchen, the same yellow she painted it the year Russell was born. I drive a 1998 GMC pickup with 210,000 miles on it and a tailgate that you have to lift just so or it won't latch. I wear Carhartt and flannel and boots I've had resoled 3 times. I take my breakfast at a diner on Route 9 where the eggs come with home fries and the waitress, she's been there longer than I've been a widower, calls me home and tops off my coffee without asking. I pay myself a salary out of one of the companies, $62,000 a year. That's the number that runs the life you can see. Everything else lives in the part of my life nobody ever thought to look at, including my son. That's the part I have to tell you straight, because it's the part the dinner cracked open, and it's the part I've spent the months since trying to figure out how to be sorry for. I raised Russell to think we were getting by. Not poor, I never let him be poor, but getting by. Hand-me-down bikes, a part-time job in high school, community college, then state, working summers in my shop because I told him a man ought to know what his hands can do. He thought the shop was the whole of it. He thought his old man was a fella who welded and got lucky enough to own the building he welded in. And I let him think it. I told myself I was doing it for him. I told myself I didn't want to raise a soft boy who'd never have to want a thing, who'd be loved for his wallet by people who'd never bother to find out if there was anything behind it. I'd seen what easy money does to a young man. I wanted my son to value work and a dollar and to know in his bones what it cost to earn one, because that knowing is the only inheritance I trusted. So I gave him the lesson and I kept the money. And I told myself the money would come to him at the end when it couldn't ruin him. What I didn't reckon with, what a smarter man would have reckoned with, is what it does to a marriage to think you married a man whose father is a charity case. My son met Margot at a wedding. Her people are from up on the kind of bluff my mother used to clean. Her father, Sterling Vance, is a name on buildings, a man who sits on boards, the sort who gets a table at the front of every room he walks into. And my boy, who is a good man and a hard worker and a better father than I was, married into all that carrying an old welder for a daddy, and I watched over 9 years as he learned to introduce me a little quieter every time. Not cruel, just quieter, the way you'd lower your voice over a thing you're managing. I never corrected it. 20-some years of practice at being invisible, and the one place it cost me most was the one place I never let myself look. Now, the dinner. It was a Friday in October, at the country club out past the reservoir, the night before they were going to cut the ribbon on a new building over at the State University, Brant State, where Sterling Vance has been a trustee for 30 years. A big building, Engineering on one side, the trades on the other, welding and machining and electrical, real shops for kids who learned the way I learned, so they wouldn't have to start the way I started, with nothing but a borrowed hood and a mean foreman. The biggest single gift in the school's history had paid for the bulk of it, and the gift was anonymous. And the dinner that night was the donor's dinner, the night before dinner, and Sterling Vance had been the public face of the whole campaign for 2 years. I'll let you sit with that a minute because I had 2 years to sit with it. The anonymous gift was mine. I gave that building. I gave it because I never got to walk into a place like that when I was a kid, and because Verna spent 34 years teaching shop math and remedial reading to boys everybody else had written off. And I wanted her name somewhere it would do some good after she was gone, except I told the lawyers to keep my name off it and let the school decide what to call it later. Sterling Vance didn't give that building. Sterling Vance organized the napkins. But you'd never know it from the way the evening was arranged, and that was fine by me because the whole point of giving it was that nobody knew. My daughter-in-law dressed me. She actually came by the house and stood in my bedroom doorway and picked the gray jacket off the hanger and held it out like she was handing a uniform to a man she wasn't sure could be trusted with one. "Gray," she said, "and let me do the tie." She tied my tie. 68 years old, and my son's wife tied my tie, and I let her, because it was easier than the conversation, and because there's a kind of tenderness even in being managed if you squint. The club did itself up nice. Long tables, the good silver, little cards with everybody's name in a hand, somebody'd been paid to write. My daughter-in-law had seen to the seating, the way she always does, because she understands a thing I understand too, that where they put you tells you exactly how much of you they want to hear. She put me at the far end, between an old fellow who turned out to be hard of hearing and a young university development officer whose whole job was to be pleasant to people who might give money and who took one look at my jacket and decided I wasn't one of them and turned the other way. Down at the head of the table sat Sterling Vance and his wife and a couple of deans and my son and Margot, all of them up where the conversation that's meant to be admired but not joined takes place. I sat. I ate. There was a beef thing and a fish thing, and I had the beef. I did not talk about the truck. I did not talk about the war. I never went. My number didn't come up, but my brothers did and didn't come back, and that's a story I keep for myself anyway. I did not get into it with anybody about the price of anything. I was so easy you'd have thought the chair was empty. The young development fellow asked me one question the whole meal. "And what's your connection to the university, sir?" "My daughter-in-law's father's on the board," I said. "Oh, lovely," he said, and turned to a woman across the table who was wearing more on one wrist than I paid for the truck. "Lovely. That's the whole of what I was at that table. Lovely and gone." Then they brought the coffee, and Sterling Vance stood up, and the room turned to him the way a field of sunflowers turns, all at once and without thinking. He's good at it. I'll give him that. He talked about vision. He talked about vision. He talked about what this building would mean for the young men and women of this region, and he had the grace, I suppose, to mention the anonymous donor, a friend of the university who wishes to remain unknown. And a little ripple went around the tables, everybody wondering who, the way people do, and a few of them glancing toward the wealthiest faces in the room, and not one of them glancing at me. And then the president of the university stood up to say a few words of her own. Dr. Ellison Reed. I'd sat across a conference table from her 4 times over those 2 years in a room with the lawyers hashing out what the building would be and how the gift would work and what it could and couldn't be named. She'd shaken my hand at the end of every one of those meetings and called me Mr. Marwick and meant it. She did not know I'd be at this dinner. I hadn't known it either until my daughter-in-law told me to wear the gray jacket. Nobody had thought to mention the embarrassing father-in-law to the university president, because why on earth would you? She had a glass in her hand, and she came around the front of the head table to speak, the way some people do, walking a little, the way a person does when they've spent a career holding the front of a room. She thanked Sterling Vance. She thanked the deans. She started down the long table, a word here, a word there, the way the night was supposed to go. And then she got to the far end, and she got to me, and she stopped. She stopped the way a needle stops when it hits a gouge in the record. The whole easy current of the evening, that smooth, warm hum of important people being pleased with themselves, had just quit. She was looking at me, and it wasn't the look you give a stranger. It was the look you'd give if you walked into the corner gas station and found the governor behind the counter making change. Pure, honest, can't make sense of it confusion. "Mr. Marwick," she said. You could feel the table tilt toward us, the way a boat does when everyone steps to one rail. I didn't. She started and stopped and started over, and I watched her do the math, watched her look at where I was sitting, at the bad end, between the deaf man and the boy who'd written me off, and watched her understand that something was very wrong with the seating. And not in a way she could fix with a smile. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea you'd be here tonight. They've got you all the way down." She turned a little helplessly toward the head of the table, toward Sterling Vance, toward my son, toward my daughter-in-law. And here she stopped one more time, and I knew the question before it came, because I'd been bracing for some version of it for 2 years, without ever once thinking it would come like this. "Do they know who you are?" I have never heard a room go that quiet. Not church, not a funeral. There's a quiet that happens when 40 well-fed, well-dressed people who all know exactly where they stand suddenly cannot find the floor. A fork stopped halfway up somewhere down the table and just hung there. I looked at her. "Ellison," I said. "First name, easy, the way you'd say it to somebody you'd done business with for 2 years. I don't think tonight's the night." But it was too late, and she knew it. And she was a woman who'd spent her life believing the truth was the kindest thing in any room, even when it was the hardest. And she wasn't going to stand there and let me be furniture. "No," she said quietly. "No, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to do that." She looked down the table. She looked at Sterling Vance. "Sterling, do you know who you've seated at the end of your table?" Sterling Vance's mouth made the shape of a man about to say something gracious, and then forgot what gracious was. "This is Otis Marwick," she said, and her voice wasn't loud, but a president's voice carries even when it's soft, the way a teacher's does, the way Myverna's did. "I have sat across the table from this man 4 times in the last 2 years. He is the friend of the university who wishes to remain unknown. She let that land. He gave the building, the whole building. Not a wing, not a naming opportunity. The building. The shops we're going to walk through tomorrow morning, the welding bays, the machine floor, the engineering labs, all of it. There is no anonymous donor. There's him. And you've got him down here next to the coffee station. I want to tell you what my daughter-in-law's face did, because I've thought about it more than anything else from that night. It went through about 4 things in the space it takes to draw one breath. First, it was confused. Why is the president talking to Pop? Then it was scared. Who you are, is Pop in some kind of trouble? Then it caught the word building and gave and dropped through into a thing I had never once seen on her face in 9 years of marriage, which was a plain animal fear. The fear of somebody who has just understood that they were standing in a room they didn't know the shape of and saying things into it they didn't know who could hear. And my son Russell, my boy who I raised on hand-me-down bikes so he'd know the weight of $1. My son was looking at me down the length of that table like he'd never seen me before in his life. And in a way, he hadn't. "Pop," he said. Just that. Just the one word, the way he used to say it when he was small and scared. and it came up out of all that pressed down silence, and it about took my legs off, even sitting down. Sterling Vance found his voice. "Otis," he said, surely there's some, 300. He couldn't even get the question out. He'd been the face of my money for 2 years, and he couldn't make his mouth wrap around the size of it. "I don't go in for the number at dinner," I said. "Bad for the digestion." Somebody laughed. One short, terrified bark of a laugh, the way people do when the tension's got nowhere else to go, and then quit because nobody was sure they were allowed. Dr. Reed pulled out the empty chair beside her, up at the head of the table, the good end, and she said, "Mr. Isterist, Marwick, would you sit up here, please?" And her voice was shaking just a little, and I understood she was not embarrassed for herself. She was embarrassed for the whole room and what it had just shown about itself, and she wanted to undo at least the part of it she could reach. I didn't move. "I'm all right here, Ellison," I said. "I like it down here. You can see the whole table from down here." And that was true, and I think she heard everything I meant by it, because she stood there a second longer, and then she nodded, slow, like a woman conceding a point in a long argument, and she sat back down. The dinner was over as a dinner after that. What was left was the cleanup: cold coffee, sweating water glasses, the particular wreckage that's left when something's gone off in a room, and everybody's too well-mannered to acknowledge the smell. The talk started up again in low pieces, but it was all about me now, sideways, the way people talk about a thing they're not looking at. My daughter-in-law got up. Her chair scraped on the floor. That one sharp sound. She didn't say anything. She walked out toward the lobby with her face doing its best to hold, and I knew it wasn't the kind of leaving where you come right back. Sterling Vance's wife, Coralie, a tall woman with white hair who hadn't said 3 words all night, who I'd taken for cold and now understood had been doing what I do, sitting back and watching the room run itself. She leaned across 2 empty seats toward me. She had a steady look on her, a look that had been somewhere and come back. "Mr. Marwick," she said, "may I ask you something?" "You may." "Why did you let your own son believe you were broke?" It hit clean. No padding on it at all. That's the question, isn't it? That's the one that's still sitting in the middle of my chest. "I wanted him to be a worker before he was an heir," I said. "I wanted to know he could stand on his own before I gave him a reason not to. And I wanted, and here I had to stop because I'd never said the rest of it out loud, not even to Verna, not in so many words. I wanted to know my boy loved me for what I was, not what I had. There's a lot of men out there love for their money, and they die never knowing if there was anything underneath it that anybody would have crossed the street for. I didn't want to be one of those men." "And do you know now," she said, "whether he loves you for yourself?" "I knew it before tonight," I said. "He's a good son. He just learned to be a little ashamed of me along the way, and I let him because I never gave him the one fact that have made the shame impossible." Coralie was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing I haven't been able to put down since. "You didn't run a test on your son, Mr. Marwick," she said. "You gave him a question and never told him there was a wrong answer. And then you spent 30 years grading him on it." She picked up her water glass and didn't drink from it. "That's not love hiding. That's a man holding a measuring stick in the dark." I found my daughter-in-law in the lobby of the club, sitting in one of those big, stiff chairs. Nobody sits in holding her phone in her lap and not looking at it. "Margot," I said. She looked up at me and her eyes were wet and furious both at once, which is a hard thing to be. $300 million, she said. "Thereabouts." "You?" She started and stopped and tried again. "I have apologized for you, to people. At my own dinner table. I've explained you. I told my own father not to give Russell a hard time because you couldn't, because we thought you—" She put her hand over her mouth. I tied your tie." "You did," I said. "You did a nice job of it." "Why would you let me do that?" And it came out of her as close to a wail as a woman like her will let herself get in the lobby of a country club. "Why would you let me think? Why would you let all of us think?" I sat down in the chair next to her. The two of us in those awful chairs, in that big cold marble room, the way the people in the houses my mother cleaned used to sit, except now it was me, and I had paid for the floor. "Because I didn't want it to change you," I said. "Same reason I never told my son. I wanted to know who you all were to me before the number got into the room. And I'll tell you the God's honest truth. The way that woman in there made me see it tonight, that was the wrong reason. It was a coward's reason dressed up as a wise man's. I told myself I was protecting Russell from soft money and protecting my own self from being loved for the wrong thing. But what I was really doing was keeping the upper hand. I knew a thing about every one of you that none of you knew about me, and I held it. And I told myself the holding was humility. It wasn't. It was the opposite. The man who knows the secret in the room is never the humble one. He's the one running it." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, the way her boy does, the way my grandson does. "You looked down on me," I said, "and I let you, because I wanted to see if you would, and you did, and that told me something true about you. But here's the part I'm only just now man enough to say. By keeping it from you, I never gave you the chance to be different. You judged a man you thought made $62,000 a year and drove a busted truck, and you found him not worth much. Maybe that's who you are. Or maybe you'd have stood up straighter if I'd ever once let you see the whole of me. I made it so you'd never find out which. That's the thing I did wrong. Not the truck, not the number. I robbed you of your own better answer." She didn't say anything for a long while. Then she said, very small, "Russell's going to be so hurt." "I know it," I said. "I've got that one coming, and I'll take it standing up. It's been a few months now. It's winter. There's frost on the truck every morning, and I scrape it off with the same plastic scraper I've had since Reagan." Russell came by the house the week after. He sat at the yellow kitchen table where he ate 10,000 breakfasts, and he didn't yell, which was almost worse. He said, "You let me work summers in your shop for $8 an hour." He said, "We had spaghetti on Thursdays because it was cheap." He said, "Dad, I borrowed money from Margot's father to start the business." I sat in his office, and I felt like a beggar, and he couldn't finish it. And he put his head down on the yellow table, my grown son, and I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I did when he was a boy, and we sat like that for a long time, and neither one of us said anything, because there wasn't the thing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. "It's not fixed. I won't sit here and tell you it's fixed. He's angry, and he's got the right to be, and the anger isn't even mostly about the money. It's about the years he spent ashamed of a thing that was never true, ashamed in front of his wife, ashamed in front of his in-laws, carrying around a smallness I'd hung on him for a lesson he never asked to learn. You can't hand a man back his own past. I've offered him everything else. He hasn't taken much of it yet. He took a little. He let me pay off the loan to her father. That mattered, I think, more for what it lifted off him than for the dollars. My daughter-in-law and I have a strange new thing between us. Not warm exactly, but honest, for the first time in 9 years. She doesn't tie my tie anymore. She asked me the other week to tell her grandson, my grandson, the story about the dog, the one she always told me not to tell. I told it. The boy laughed so hard he fell off the couch. That boy, my grandson Milo, he's 11, and he's the only one of them who didn't have a thing in the world to unlearn that night because he was home with a sitter, and to him I have always just been Grandpa, the one with the truck, the one with the truck, the one who lets him run the welder with the hood on and his daddy's hand on the trigger. After the dust started to settle, he climbed up next to me on the porch one evening, and he said, "Grandpa, are you rich?" "I've got enough," I said. "Mom says you have a building at the college." "I do." He thought about that, the way kids do, all the way through. "Can I see the welding part?" he said. "Not the engineering part, not the labs, not the part with his great-grandmother's name on the wall, which they put up, after all, VERNA in stone over the trades wing, where the kids who learn with their hands go in. The welding part." "Tomorrow," I said. "We'll go tomorrow." And I thought about my own daddy, walked out of that foundry with a clock and a cough, and not one person on the floor of his life who ever knelt down to see who'd kept it shining. And I thought about how I swore I'd never be invisible like him, and how I went and made myself invisible anyway on purpose, with both hands, for 40 years. Took the very thing the world did to my father and did it to myself, and then, God forgive me, did it to my own boy. The man at the end of the table isn't invisible anymore. They see me now. That part's done. The harder part is the part I'm only starting, learning to be a man who lets himself be seen on purpose. After a lifetime of believing the seeing would cost me something true, it's slow going, slower than building anything I ever built. But my grandson wants to see the welding part, and his daddy's coming with us, and that's a place to start. So that's where I am, on the porch, in the cold, with enough. If you're the one they sit at the bad end of the table, the one they tell to keep quiet, the one they explain instead of introduce, I'm not going to tell you to stand up and announce yourself. That's not the lesson. The lesson is the other one, the one it took a stranger and a country club and the worst dinner of my life to teach me. Whatever it is you're holding back to keep the upper hand, to stay safe, to find out who people are when they think you're nobody, let it go, not because they've earned it, because every day you hold it, you're the one in the dark, holding the measuring stick, grading the people you love on a test they never knew they were taking. Put the stick down, turn on the light, let them see you and let yourself find out, once and for all, whether they'd have crossed the street for you anyway. I think mine would have. I think I cost us all 30 years finding out. Tomorrow, the welding part. That's enough to be going on with. The number was never the thing. I want to be plain about that, sitting here with the frost melting off the truck. $300 million didn't make Margot cry in that lobby, and it didn't put my son's head down on the yellow kitchen table. What did the damage was the 30 years I held a fact in the dark and called the holding humility. Coralie saw it clean when nobody else would say it. I gave my boy a question and never told him there was a wrong answer. Then I spent his whole life quietly grading him on it. That's the cause. Everything that happened at that country club was the effect, arriving 30 years late and all at once. Here's what I'd want a younger man to take from it, the one sitting at the bad end of his own table right now. Doing right by the people you love is not the same as protecting yourself from them. I told myself that hiding the money was the decent thing, the unselfish thing, when the truth is, it kept me the only person in the room who knew the whole story, and a man who's always holding the secret is never really humble. He's just in charge and calling it modesty. Real decency would have been letting Russell see me whole and trusting him to love me anyway. I didn't have the nerve for that. I had nerve for 40 years of welding and buying and waiting, but not for the one brave thing in front of me. And nerve matters, but only pointed the right way. I built everything I built by being able to outlast a hard thing, by getting up before the sun and outworking my own doubt. That same stubbornness turned inward is what let me sit silent through 200 dinners while my son learned to be ashamed of me. The grit that makes you is the same grit that can wall you off, and the only way to tell them apart is to keep your eyes open and your pride low enough to be corrected. It took a stranger, Allison Reed, refusing to let me be furniture, to crack me open. I should have cracked myself open years sooner. So I put the stick down, turn on the light, let the people you love see the whole of you, the truck and the bank both, and find out for certain whether they'd have crossed the street for you when they thought you were nobody. Maybe they would, maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But at least you'll know, and they'll have had a fair chance to be better than your fear of them. I think Russell would have crossed the street. I cost us 30 years finding out, and I'm spending what I've got left making it right, one porch evening at a time, with a grandson who wants to see the welding part and a son who's starting to come back. That's enough to be going on with.